Well, hello there. It's great to see you again. Welcome to the latest edition of the Ezra File. And on this edition of the Ezra File, we're picking up where we left off, not last time, but the time before that. You might remember the time before that, we looked at Leslie Newbigin's roadmap to the present. And we had chance only to cover a little bit of what Newbigin said. So welcome today to part two of Newbigin's roadmap to the present. And of course, what we're doing with these things, these roadmaps to the present, is we're trying to understand where we are as Christians. We're trying to understand the society, the culture in which we live, how we got here, and what it means for us as Christians, and what it means for us to be able to pass on and communicate our faith in Jesus Christ in today's world. And as I said, we did a little bit with Newbigin, and just to refresh your memory, you might remember Newbigin. I told you about him. There he is. Sadly died over 20 years ago, but he spent a career as a missionary in India, and he enjoyed a stellar career. He ended up being a bishop, did Newbigin, but he went out in the 1930s to India, and I say, when he retired in the 70s, he came back home. He and his wife hitchhiked back home from India to England. And when he got back home, he got the shock of his life. He found that he'd come back to something that was an even bigger mission field than the one that he'd left in South India. And the latter part of Newbigin's life, the sort of 25 years before he died, he devoted himself to asking himself the question, how we can be Christians here in our society, in modern Western culture. And you might remember we looked at Newbigin's diagnosis of the situation. How is it that we've got here? Why is the West, why is England and Western Europe, why is it so impervious to the gospel? And we saw that the key for Newbigin was the thinking of the French philosopher René Descartes, and a 17th century thinker. And we saw that for Newbigin, Descartes marked a turning point in Western culture. And we live today, the society in which we live today is really a society bequeathed to us by the work, by the thought of René Descartes. And if you remember, we said that modern Western culture is a dualism. It has two parts to it, two categories of the dualism, and we looked at it in terms of above the line and below the line. They're two completely separate worlds. We have on the one hand a public world of scientific facts. Science tells us the facts. Facts are undoubtable or indubitable, as Newbigin says. And facts, science, maths, involve no personal commitment. There's no faith or personal commitment in the world of science and mathematics. It's just science and mathematics. It's entirely objective truth, so that no one can doubt it, and there's no personal commitment, allegedly, on behalf of the person who learns science and mathematics. That's one world, the public world. The other world, the private world, which is completely separate. The private world is a private world of personal values, personal commitments, faith commitments, religion, personal values, the gospel. That's where our society puts the gospel. And of course, in the world of values, they are optional. You have your beliefs, I have my beliefs, and the guy down the road has his beliefs. And there's no way of telling apart the two of them. And so Newbigin says here what we have is basically an objective world, objective truth that has no basis in any kind of faith commitment, and then a private world of faith commitments, and there's no objective way in telling any difference between them. And Newbigin has a little phrase that he uses to describe this. He calls this the plausibility structure of our culture. All cultures have a plausibility structure. When he was in India, there was a plausibility structure there, and in the West, there's a plausibility structure here. The plausibility structure of any society controls what is taken to be true, what is taken to be real. The plausibility structure governs. If you ever tried talking about religion in public or in a pub or anything, and you feel a little bit uncomfortable about it, you're not quite sure it, and you're looking over your shoulder, think, well, who's listening? Who's going to laugh at me, kind of thing. Well, that's when you do that, you are coming up against the plausibility structure of our society. It governs what ideas are allowed to be discussed in public. It kind of describes what people accept as obvious, what you can say without anybody disagreeing with you, what people just accept without really thinking about it. That is the plausibility structure. And Newbigin says, after Descartes, that the world that Descartes bequeathed to us, that's it. That's the plausibility structure of our society. And Newbigin has a little phrase to describe that encapsulates that. He gets it from the guy called Carver Yu. Carver Yu's a Chinese Christian, Chinese thinker. And Carver Yu has the benefit of being able to view Western Christianity from the perspective of China. And Carver Yu was apparently, he was educated in Confucian philosophy and Chinese way of looking at things, and he became Christian, and he applied all that to Western culture. And he said, Western culture, you can sum it up, you can encapsulate it in that phrase: technological optimism, but literary despair. Technological optimism and literary despair. What does he mean by that? What does Newbigin mean by that? Well, he means if you look at the world above the line, the world of science, the world of maths, that's what provides us with our technology. And we are quite confident that the next model of iPhone will come along and it will be better than the previous models of iPhone. We expect that. That's not a problem. One day we will put a man on Mars. We can be confident about that. We don't doubt science's ability to do that. And should we run into COVID-23 or 24, then we are pretty confident that a vaccine by and by will be found. We are, we are confident in the bit above the line. But below the line, well, it's literary despair. And what Carver Yu meant by that was, of course, where do you find society's discussions about life, the universe and everything? Where do you find society's discussion of the big questions of life? Who am I? Where do I come from? Where do I go? Well, you find it in their literature. And Carver Yu said, if you read the literature in Western culture, then those questions are admit of no answer. Western culture has no answer to the big questions of life. It has no real proper answer to the questions of who am I, where do I come from, where do I go? Why? Because they belong to the world of optional values. You have your understanding, I have my understanding, the guy down the road has his understanding. Asking which understanding is true is rather like saying which flavor of ice cream do you like. I like chocolate, he likes vanilla, and the guy down the road likes tutti frutti. And so Western culture has no answer to the big questions of life. It is therefore in despair. It cannot talk about good or evil, right or wrong, truth or error. That, says Newbigin, is where we are at. Technological optimism, but literary despair. And there's one person that Newbigin highlights who saw this coming. He knew where we were going. There is one person who saw with crystal clarity what the world post-Descartes must lead to. And here he is, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. I guess you may have heard of Nietzsche. You may have heard his famous phrase, God is dead. God is dead and we have killed him. Well, Nietzsche also had another little phrase. He talked about the will to power. And Nietzsche saw, this was back in the 19th century, he saw that the world post-Descartes, if values, if truth was just simply a matter of personal preference, then that could only lead one way. Nietzsche said, if there's no way of telling the difference between right and wrong, truth and error, that must mean that any claim to truth must be a claim to power. Power decides truth. The person, the one who has the most power, will be able to enforce his views on others. And Nietzsche said it is legitimate to use power to enforce your truth. And Nietzsche was a prophet. We live in Descartes' world, but we also live in Nietzsche's world as well. There you go, the cancel culture. If you don't like the cancel culture, blame Friedrich Nietzsche. Truth and power. All claims to truth are simply a claim to power. And you can see that all around us. Say the wrong thing on Facebook. Say that marriage is between a man and a woman. Say that men are men and women are women, and you can't, one can't change into the other. And you will be barred from Facebook. You may even be visited by the police, and it's probably not long before you get locked up for it. Why is the cancel culture happening? Well, you can go back to Friedrich Nietzsche. If there is no truth, it is simply about power. So there's the plausibility structure of our society, the split between public and private. And Newbigin says that you will not find that anywhere else. It didn't exist in India, and it doesn't exist anywhere else in the whole world. And Newbigin looks at that and says, as Christians, we cannot accept that. This is not Christian. The West is not a Christian culture. In fact, people who are brought up in the West, in Western culture, far from becoming and being Christians, they are almost inoculated against it, because that plausibility structure undermines the claims of the gospel at their most fundamental level, because it privatizes them and it relativizes them. Your views are just the same, just as good as anybody else's. One religion is really just the same as any other religion, and it's really just the same as having no religion. So why don't you have no religion? And Newbigin says we just can't rest with that. We just can't pretend somehow that doesn't matter. And so Newbigin formulates his own famous phrase. If you look up Leslie Newbigin on the internet, you won't have to read much about him before you encounter that phrase, Newbigin's missionary encounter with Western culture. And he said, that's how we have to respond. Just as when I went to India in the 1930s, and it's fairly blatantly obvious that India wasn't a Christian culture. And I went there as a missionary. I had to understand it. I had to learn how to speak about my faith to people who were raised in Indian culture. So we have to do the same in today's world in the West. And as you can see there, there's a couple of quotes from him. It would seem, therefore, that there is no higher priority than to ask the question of what would be involved in a genuine missionary encounter between the gospel and this modern Western culture. We can't simply assume that people will become just Christians because they're born in the West. Previous generations have assumed that, and that has turned out to be a massive mistake. Newbigin says we cannot any longer rest with that. We must see that we must respond as missionaries in a foreign culture. And then he says, this England is a pagan society, and the development of a truly missionary encounter with this very tough form of paganism is the greatest intellectual and practical task facing the church, the greatest intellectual and practical task facing the church. And after nearly 25 years of being a vicar, I would say Newbigin has hit the nail absolutely on the head. And I would say that as a church, we are failing in the biggest intellectual and practical task that has ever been put in front of us. One of the reasons why I started the Ezra file was to at least try in some very small, for some minuscule, tiny way to address the intellectual questions that we need to answer as Christians. And of course, the practical questions that we need to ask likewise, we are failing badly at addressing them. So that's what we've got to do, says Newbigin. We've got to respond as though we are in a missionary situation. And the way that he frames that the way that he frames the missionary encounter with Western culture. He puts it in these terms. He says this from one of his books. The first book of Newbigin I read, Foolishness to the Greeks. If you want to start anywhere, buy Foolishness to the Greeks. He says this: what would it mean if instead of trying to explain the gospel in terms of modern scientific culture, we tried to explain our culture in terms of the gospel? The plausibility structure of the West, that will seek to explain our faith in its terms. And he does it by privatizing it and relativizing it. Newbigin says we have to turn the tables. Instead of allowing that to dictate to us, we must seek to explain that from the perspective of our faith. So how do we do it? How do we engage in this missionary endeavor? How do we explain that in the terms of our faith, in terms of the gospel? Well, Newbigin says, well, let's start with the public category. Let's start with the bit above the line. This world of absolute objectivity, a world where all personal commitments, all faith commitments are allegedly removed. Newbigin says, let's have a look at that. Let's examine that, shall we? And he does that. And he says that bit above the world, he calls it the illusion of absolute objectivity. In other words, that bit above the line doesn't exist. It's an illusion. And you can see there are some reasons why he says that, some reasons that he gives for saying that bit above the line actually really doesn't exist. It's an illusion. And it doesn't exist for these reasons. First of all, faith, not doubt, leads to knowledge. If you remember, if we go back to Descartes began by doubting. He began asking himself, I can doubt this, I can doubt that, I can doubt the other. What is it that I can't doubt? And so if you remember, we said that Descartes' method was to say that doubt leads to certainty. Newbigin says that is an illusion because it's impossible to doubt all your beliefs at the same time. You can only doubt something on the basis of something else that at that particular moment you are not doubting. You can only doubt something on the basis of something that at that particular moment you are holding as an article of faith. Faith is primary. Doubt is always secondary in the search for knowledge. Second reason why all of that's an illusion, absolute objectivity is an illusion. The second reason is the bit above the line deals with science and mathematics. Well, mathematics, as it turns out, is not mathematically provable. and Newbigin quotes the work of an Austrian mathematician called Kurt Gödel. And Gödel set himself that task. He thought, can I prove mathematics mathematically? And he found out that he couldn't. And in fact, I don't want to go into it too much, but what Gödel said that mathematics rests on a set of assumptions. It rests on a set of axioms that cannot themselves be proven mathematically. And actually Gödel goes even further than that, and Newbigin goes further with him. And he says that actually all systems of belief, any system of belief, doesn't have to be mathematics, can be anything, secular or religious, any belief system is based on a set of assumptions, a set of axioms that cannot themselves be proven from within that belief system. In other words, Gödel is saying the same as Newbigin in the first bullet point, that faith is the basis of knowledge. Third reason why absolute objectivity is an illusion is because science cannot provide a photocopy of reality. Science cannot explain everything. Modern science has actually revealed that to us. In the world of quantum physics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, there is a built-in indeterminacy of our knowledge of the universe. If you want to look up Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, there's actually an Ezra File video on quantum mechanics. If you want to find it, just flick through the back issues. And the last reason why absolute objectivity is an illusion is because the human mind is not neutral. The human mind cannot be separated from its historical and cultural background. If you remember Descartes' famous little phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. What lies behind that is that Descartes thought he could abstract the human mind from its historical and cultural background. You can't. One of the genuine insights of what we call postmodernism today is you can't do that. Descartes' assumption was actually an illusion. We are all shaped by our culture. We are all shaped by our cultural and historical background. So Newbigin says we can look at the bit above the line from the perspective of faith, and we can see the importance of faith. We can see the importance of faith in how knowledge is generated, how we come to know anything. And what Newbigin says is that the Descartes' understanding separated out two things. It separated the objective pole of knowledge from the subjective pole of knowledge. He tried to imagine that you can separate out the human subject from the knowledge which the human subject seeks. And that is the illusion on which modern Western culture is built. And that is why we may well have technological optimism, but we are heading towards literary despair. So that's the bit above the line. What about the bit below the line, where all values are privatized and relativized? How can we speak about Christianity as being in any sense true? In what way is Christianity true in the way that other belief systems, whether secular or religious, are not true? How can we speak about the truthfulness of the gospel in our Western culture? Well, if you want to know how Newbigin does that, you'll have to come back for the next episode of the Newbigin Roadmap. Be seeing you.